Dynasty 101, lesson number 2. We talked about evaluating your league market, macro versus micro in the first episode. This one we'll be talking about breaking down a breakout candidate and how you want to spot breakout candidates basically at every position and how this can kind of be advantageous to us in dynasty leagues and help, further our teams and help us build those dynasties that we're hopefully aiming to build. So before we get into it, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well, doing well. And yeah, you guys would have already saw how we attack the startup. Bush, of course, bringing down the key things to know when you're getting into Dynasty. This video is more so when you're in your startup, what really you should be looking for once you get into those late stages of your draft, those mid to late rounds, those players that can really accumulate value and really give you an edge over the rest of your league. So yeah, I'm ready to roll, and let's waste no time. Let's get right into the video.
All right, so you probably know by now that spotting a breakout candidate would be advantageous to your dynasty roster, but this is exactly why it's advantageous and why it helps us. If you're in a rebuilding type of scenario right now, you're building a dynasty team and you're not ready to compete yet, the reason we still want to be able to spot breakout candidates is because it's one of the best sources of value accumulation. Let's say you draft a wide receiver in round 8 or 9 or 10 or something, which is usually around the range where breakout candidate wide receivers will go. Think of your, Elijah Moore, Rashad Bateman, Kadarius Toney types right now. If they perform in season and they break out from a fantasy perspective, they're going to grow their stock because they're young wide receivers to, a 4th round pick, a 5th round pick, 6th round pick. And for you as a rebuilding team, even though you're not reaping the benefits of those production, you're still getting the value accumulation to be able to then hold that player into when you finally decide to contend or sell that player off for a profit.
Yeah, no, exactly. When you're rebuilding, you want those players that aren't depreciating assets, that aren't kind of stuck in limbo. You want those players that can elevate themselves to, like you said, the 4th round of the startup. So yeah, no, I totally agree there. However, though, if you're a contender, you're kind of focused on that production, spotting those players that can give you the production right away. Let's just say hypothetically, you draft a receiver, he's ready to be that wide receiver 5 or 6 on your roster. If he breaks out and he has, a wide receiver 22 finishing points per game, that gives you a ton more depth in season, a big time boost to your flex spots, and ultimately helps you on your quest to competing for a championship.
Yeah, and it also, if you decide after the season to rebuild, it also gives you a value accumulation like we kind of just talked about, where you could sell off that player. Let's say, for example, Christian Kirk this year, if you drafted him last offseason, you probably got him in like the 11th, 12th round of the startup or something like that. He became a wide receiver 2 in fantasy, and you could, if you decided to rebuild the season, sell him off for a profit and then be on your merry way kind of thing. So that's definitely why we want to spot breakout candidates. And we kind of just use wide receivers as the example, but we're going to go by breakout indicators by each position group and kind of use these as like a checklist. So we're going to talk about some of the indicators that you should look for to help you identify which players might be likely to break out. And then we'll give some examples as well of players that have broken out using some of these indicators that you would have been able to spot before their breakout, and also discuss some of the like do's and don'ts when you're targeting breakout candidate players. And that'll mostly apply at the wide receiver position because they're the most popular breakout candidates that we usually see. But each position will kind of have some similar indicators. Each position will have some unique ones. But let's start with the quarterback position, because quarterback is generally pretty easy, I would say, to predict breakout candidates. And it's very important too in superflex leagues, which me and Danny mostly play in. But quarterback is an opportunity-based position. It kind of goes without saying that there needs to be a path for them to start games for them to break out, because if they're not a starting quarterback, it's going to be kind of difficult for that to happen outside of, injury replacement, all that kind of stuff. Aside from just being a starter, some of the other breakout indicators that you could look for from a fantasy perspective are things like rushing upside, right? We know we love our quarterbacks to be able to run the ball. That will generate us fantasy points, and probably even more so than the passing stuff will. And it'll help cover up, a passing deficient type of quarterback in fantasy. Surrounding cast, especially if they are more of your prototypical pocket passer. And then other talent indicators are important as well, because if they're, let's say a 2nd-year quarterback or a 3rd-year quarterback, using your eyes, watching their rookie season, watching their 2nd season, obviously got to watch the tape sometimes, and also leaning on metrics like, their PFF passing grade in their rookie season, their quarterback rating, accuracy stuff, all that kind of stuff kind of goes into evaluating a potential breakout candidate quarterback. And a perfect example of this from both sides of the spectrum would have been Tua Tagovailoa this year, right? He was the former 5th overall pick quarterback in the 2020 draft. He showed well in some metrics in his first 2 years, accuracy, some of those other metrics as a sophomore. The breakout candidate only got put on to Tua Tagovailoa this year, though, when he got Tyreek Hill and when he got this new coaching staff there in Miami, who was previously successful with a quarterback of his archetype.
Yeah, 100%. You saw with Tua that the surrounding cast met him. Tua Tagovailoa had Tyreek Hill, had Jalen Waddle. And like you said, the coaching definitely mattered there, opening up a scheme that really let Tua thrive. So we saw him develop as a passer. We saw him develop that accuracy that we saw at Alabama, and it was on full display this past year. Another one would be Justin Fields, former top 10 pick at the position in the 2021 draft. Great college profile, one of the top recruits coming into college, showed out at Ohio State, ended up getting that top 10 draft capital, like you said. He has all the rushing upside you could imagine. We saw it on display this past year, despite, lackluster passing to the most degree, which, again, the surrounding cast wasn't great. We saw that the 1,100 rushing yards that he was able to contribute gave him an elite advantage. And we're seeing now that he already broke out. He has some attributing factors this offseason that can help him out, the acquisition of DJ Moore. So he's already broken out, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has an extra breakout year.
Yeah, and again, speaking back to the first point of contending versus rebuilding, if you were contending and you drafted Tua, let's say in a Superflex startup last offseason in the 4th, 5th round where he was probably going, there was points in time, man, where Tua Tagovailoa was up near the 2nd round, the late 1st round. At the mid-season point after that 6-touchdown game against Baltimore, Tua's value absolutely flew up startup boards. And if you guys were doing a mid-season startup, I'm sure people had to take him very, very highly. And if you wanted to, if you're a rebuilder and you didn't have interest in holding him, you could have sold him for a very, very high price at that point in time. And same goes with Justin Fields. If you were a rebuilding team, you invested in a young quarterback like Justin Fields in the 3rd, 4th round, give or take, of a Superflex startup this time last offseason, then you would have big time reaped those benefits. He's now a top 8 startup pick, top 10 startup pick.
Yeah, 100%. You saw it from both cases. Tua Tagovailoa with the accuracy, with the surrounding cast, Justin Fields with the rushing upside. An example of a guy that could potentially break out this year that really has all of these points to his favor. It's a guy like Trey Lance. Top 3 draft capital in his draft. We already know that the talent in San Francisco is great. The coaching in San Francisco, oddly enough, where Mike McDaniel's coming from, is great. And like with Justin Fields, that 1,100 rushing yard upside, I can absolutely see being the case for Trey Lance. A little bit more risk there, but if he does break out, he could have a Justin Fields level ascension.
Right, and that kind of goes back to the first point about the quarterback position is opportunity-based. So he needs to keep the starting job to be able to break out. But if he does, then like you said, it shouldn't be too hard to see him actually, fulfill that breakout candidacy. So let's get into the running back position. And, like we just said, it's kind of an opportunity-based position at quarterback. Absolutely the definition of opportunity-based at running back.
Yeah, it's one where a player is most likely to break out within their first few years in the league. Some exceptions, a guy like Austin Eckler, a guy like Aaron Jones, but the biggest indicator for a running back being given that opportunity is through their draft capital. Backs taken in the 1st round are basically almost guaranteed to have some leeway with the coaching staff. They're given the benefit of the doubt. Obviously, that team investment's so high that the team needs them to succeed to validate the pick. As we know, everybody's already saying running backs don't matter, running backs don't matter. So if a team takes one in the 1st round, they have to have a plan with his usage. And the same goes to a certain degree with the 2nd and 3rd round picks also have a good hit rate, but it starts to tail off come day 3. So my advice here, prioritize, of course, those round 1 picks, but those round 2 and 3 picks also have a very good chance at increasing in value if they get that opportunity, which they should with the team investment.
Yeah, draft capital, obviously a big time indicator with the running back position. The sooner a back can get on the field, the sooner they're going to take advantage of the fact that their position is opportunity based.
Yeah, no, absolutely there. The other one we should be looking at is comparing the opportunity. People think, oh, the raw touches is what matters here. Raw touches is not to be viewed on an even scale. If you got 2 running backs that are giving you 300 touches this year, but one's giving you 80 of those as receptions and getting some valuable goal line work, that workload is much more conducive to fantasy success than just, a between the tackles, 1st and 2nd down grinder.
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately being able to identify the backs that can contribute on all 3 downs is basically the formula for identifying these running backs, and obviously things like size and draft capital factor into that decision.
Absolutely. The volume gives a great baseline. It gives you a really, really high floor as a guy like Najee Harris in his rookie year got that volume, was able to be an RB1. But we also have to acknowledge that the offensive success does matter when we're evaluating that ceiling. A guy like Austin Eckler being able to punch in touchdowns, receiving work on a very, very good offense with the Chargers. CMC, once he got dealt to the 49ers, obviously one of the better offenses in the league as well there. And then, of course, my beloved Dallas Cowboys, Tony Pollard. Great situation there for him to be able to score fantasy points.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that, like we have the two most recent breakouts, I would say, this past year. One being Kenneth Walker, who, like you said, kind of fits the prototype young running back, rookie coming into the season, high day two draft capital. Initially split time with Rashad Penny, but once Penny went down, was an absolute league winner down the stretch, 9 rushing touchdowns in his final 12 games, all the whole 9 yards. But the checklist was there for him, right? Great athlete, good draft capital profile that we had with him. Goes to a situation that was actually better than we expected, but for the most part, Kenneth Walker was a relatively easy breakout candidate spot.
Yeah, all of the inside the 5 carries for the Seahawks this year, they used him in that valuable part of their offense, being able to punch in touchdowns, and 9 rushing touchdowns for a rookie that didn't start until week 5. Absolutely phenomenal year for Kenneth Walker. And as a result, he's now a top 5 running back in Dynasty. The other breakout, I kind of alluded to Tony Pollard, but he was a huge breakout in this 2022 season. He's one of the exceptions to that draft capital rule, but he was a player that semi broke out in 2021. You saw the flashes, running back 3 type of finish, but we saw everything we wanted to see from an efficient receiving upside standpoint. But he was stuck behind that contract of Ezekiel Elliott. However, coming into the year, we kind of figured that Zeke was breaking down. It was clear as day that Tony Pollard was the more talented back. And if Dallas really wanted to get their best offense on the field, Tony Pollard was going to have a bigger role. So he was going, 7th round of underdog drafts. The risk was baked in, but obviously the reward showed itself out. Top 10 overall back this past season. Reading the tea leaves, we saw that he can contribute on all 3 downs, got more valuable work in this offense. And as a result, he saw a top 10 finish, and he saw his running back value go from RB30 last offseason this time to now he's currently the running back 10 on Keep Trade Cut. So if you invested in him, you could probably get him at that time in dynasty drafts, maybe, round 10, round 11. He's a guy who's going in the mid rounds now, round 5, round 6, round 7 type of pick.
Yeah, spotting a breakout candidate is extremely, extremely important. And like we kind of alluded to at the beginning of the video, if you were a rebuilder and drafted Tony Pollard last year or a contender and drafted Tony Pollard last year, it paid off either way. For rebuilders, you could have sold him midseason for a boatload of assets, or even now, because he's still valued as a top 10 running back in Dynasty at the moment, because now he's on the franchise tag with the Cowboys and Zeke's no longer there. Or if you're a contender, I'm sure he probably helped you win your championship with the production that he gave you last year. So those were some running back breakouts. Again, one guy was more of your like prototype breakout candidate, Kenneth Walker, early draft pick, comes into the NFL and breaks out. Tony Pollard, a little bit more of like a sketchy path to get to the breakout candidate. But the underlying factors were, we knew he was talented. As soon as he gets the opportunity, he has a real chance. This could be the year he gets that opportunity because Zeke's on his last legs. And eventually, if Pollard takes over, he's going to be great. And that's exactly how it played out. So we can move on to the wide receiver position. And I would say these next 2, wide receiver and tight end, are more difficult to spot breakout candidates than quarterback and running back, because like we said, with quarterback and running back, all they really need is a QB needs a starting job. A running back needs to be able to be a starter as well and get a lot of touches. But with wide receiver, the breakout indicators are simple in theory, but they're hard in practice. So talented wide receivers break out. That's the underlying principle that I pretty much always base wide receiver breakout candidates on, that you always do, that we always preach to do. Determining the talent of a wide receiver is the difficult part. Not saying that talented wide receivers break out. So we rely on things like draft capital, their draft profile, opportunity for targets, routes, quarterback play, the scheme that they play, and all that stuff factors in. But the underlying thing that always needs to be in the back of our minds is, what is their actual ability? How talented are they? Because that is what propels them to actually break out in fantasy. We can use metrics like yards per route run, like target share, targets per route run, Matt Harmon's reception perception, either when they're coming out of college or, their first couple of years in the NFL, or we can use our own eyes. Of course, you can watch the tape as well. The biggest misconception that I think a lot of people have about the wide receiver position and spotting breakouts is treating it like quarterback or running back.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people you'll see throw the term around, oh, look at the vacated targets in this situation, or there's nobody ahead of him on the depth chart now. Maybe they're going to use that now to prop up a guy like Terrace Marshall. That is the wrong way to do it, because if the market's already understanding an increased opportunity, but the skill level of the player has not increased, it's more than likely the team's going to bring in direct competition. And even if they don't, we can't trust that player to be a number 1 caliber wide receiver just because they're slated on the depth chart. If they're not performing because they weren't talented enough to get onto the field beforehand, what makes you think when they're on the field, they're going to suddenly be a stud? And if the team sees that he's not performing to the level that they expected, they can absolutely bring in competition. We see all the time in the NFL, if a team needs a wide receiver because the receiver room isn't getting it done, they'll go to the trade market. They'll go to the NFL draft. They won't stick with the wide receiver room, and they won't stick with, let's just say, Terrace Marshall in the past or a guy like Denzel Mims a couple years ago. Just because they have an opening on the depth chart does not mean that they're ready to fill that opening.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw David Bell, a prospect that I liked, get absolutely neutralized with this Elijah Moore trade, right? Like some people may have made the conclusion, hey, David Bell's a young player. Amari Cooper's getting a little bit older. Maybe he steps into some vacated production this year, but they didn't believe in David Bell, the Cleveland Browns, so they bring in Elijah Moore. Like we see this all the time. People will point to like your Josh Palmers and your KJ Osbornes of the world, and those guys can give you some production, but for the most part, just because wide receiver X leaves in free agency or gets traded or whatever, it doesn't automatically mean the guy who's directly behind him is going to suddenly become some elite wide receiver. It's part of the equation, and it can definitely aid things, especially if, the wide receiver that we want to break out wasn't able to get on the field or play a certain role. For example, Chris Godwin for my Tampa Bay Buccaneers a couple years ago, because we had Deshaun Jackson and because we had some of these other guys, Godwin wasn't running routes as much as we wanted him to see. But once Deshaun Jackson was cut, once we moved on from him, then we knew Chris Godwin was already talented because of those underlying metrics, yards per route run, Matt Harmon's reception perception, those kind of things, and his draft profile. Once he actually got those opportunities is when the stars aligned. And sometimes those breakouts are extremely easy to spot, right? We're going to see talented player meets more opportunity. That's when you see an easy breakout candidate.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get into it in a second, but somebody on my own team saw this happen as well. I'll let you take it away with some of the recent breakouts.
Yeah, like I said, there's some obvious examples. CeeDee Lamb of your Dallas Cowboys was an easy one, right? We were drafting him as if he was already broken out because it was so easy to see that he was going to, because he was your first round wide receiver. Everybody loved him. Film guys, analytics guys, whoever you talk to, everybody liked CeeDee Lamb. Amari Cooper moves on in free agency. You mentioned during the summer that CeeDee Lamb's going to work more on the outside, move around on the formation and all that kind of stuff. CeeDee Lamb's breakout was extremely easy to spot, as was Chris Godwin's, by the way, in 2019, as was Calvin Ridley's in 2020 when they finally moved on from Julio Jones. But using these principles can help you detect the less obvious breakout candidates, which are obviously the ones that are not going to be going very, very highly in startups, because even in Dynasty startups, CeeDee Lamb was treated as a top 5 wide receiver, even though he had never broken out yet. Same goes for Godwin and Ridley those years. But guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown last year, who were going high in startups, they were, top 6 to 8 round picks, but there was not a perfect storm of events that happened for him. There was a little bit of tea leaves that you had to read with a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown. Even despite him falling to round 4 of the NFL draft in 2021, he had a great profile. He was a good prospect. He should have been a day 2 pick in my mind. And more importantly, we saw him dominate as a rookie, right? We saw the target share, the reception perception numbers, all that stuff aligned for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And people faded him or discounted him because there was too many mouths to feed and Hawkinson and Swift weren't there. Whatever the case was, the arguments that we were making. But now he's a top 2 round startup pick. So if you guys invested in him as a 6th round, a 7th round, 8th round startup pick as a rebuilder or contender, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is now worth a top 30 overall pick in startups right now.
Yeah, and I mean, and moving forward, people were so focused on a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, what his pre-draft conception was. They got scared when he fell to the 4th round, and usually that, the draft capital usually does matter, but they were ignoring the fact that this is a guy who commanded in his rookie season, in 17 games, he commanded 119 targets. He got over 900 receiving yards, 90 receptions as a rookie receiver that, quite frankly, didn't really get much of the opportunity until halfway through the season. So if you really focus on what he was doing, the second half of that 2021 rookie season, he was producing as if he was like Cooper Kupp. So looking back on it now, it's kind of foolish. Like, how are people not fully bought into this breakout? This is a rookie player that was giving over 20 PPR points per game in the back half of the season. And people were so quick to say, oh, Hawkinson was out, Swift was out. People were so quick to make excuses to fill their narrative without recognizing a talented breakout caliber player.
Yeah, I mean, people did the same thing with this next guy, his rookie season, because Brandon Ayuk also had like a second breakout because he broke out as a rookie, had like 15 points per game, was a top 18 wide receiver in fantasy, fell flat on his face as a second-year receiver. He was in the doghouse, and everybody hated that draft pick if you guys spent a 4th rounder in redraft on him. But he broke out again this year, right? He had a top 25 finish in points per game this year. And this was definitely a tougher breakout to predict. There was tons of target competition. Debo was coming off a top 5 season. We know George Kittle was very talented. We had, Trey Lance, who was a rushing quarterback that people didn't love about Ayuk's situation. But again, if you just stuck with the principle that talented wide receivers produce and talented wide receivers can break out no matter what, you would have invested in Brandon Ayuk when he was like the wide receiver 40 before the season in Dynasty startups, which was probably like a 10th round startup pick.
Yeah.
And same goes for, back when he was not producing his second season, or even midway through this year. By like week 6, week 7, he was producing from a fantasy perspective, and he was still being valued as like wide receiver 40 in Dynasty startups. So this was a guy that, if you trusted what we saw as a rookie, top 20 season in points per game, PFF grade was very, along the lines, range of outcomes wise, of some of the better receivers, rookie seasons that we've seen, targets per route run, all that kind of stuff that proves his talent was there. We just saw a wonky second year out of him. You would have invested in him a ton last offseason.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree there. When it came to Brandon Ayuk, the talent was always clearly there, but people, like I kind of say with Amon St. Brown, would rather make excuses, would rather form their narratives, the objective information that we have available to us. So fully agree with you with Brandon Ayuk. I think we can move on, though, to the tight end position. And as we know, outside of the elite guys, it's an absolute crapshoot. Corey, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, and this is a position you're going to miss a lot on breakout candidates, because tight ends just generally don't hit at that high of a rate. But it doesn't mean we still shouldn't try. And I think part of that is baked into the cost of breakout candidate tight ends, because breakout candidate wide receivers are priced very highly in Dynasty startups. Even if they haven't broken out yet, they're still like 5th to 8th round startup picks. But with tight ends, breakout candidates can be found in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th round of a startup. For example, in our listener league startup, I just took Greg Dulcich. I think we're in like the 9th round right now. So your breakout candidates can come at a little bit of a cheaper cost as a result, but the indicators are similar to wide receivers. Ideally, we want tight end prospects who have good draft profiles, who went high in the draft, top 3 rounds of the NFL draft, productive in college. Athleticism does translate more so than some other position groups. So most tight ends typically need a relative athletic score, according to MathBomb, of 7.0 or better. They usually need to be good weight adjusted speed as well, like 250 pounds, run at least like a 4.7 or faster kind of thing. And similar to the wide receiver position, the talent of the player is ultimately what determines if they break out or not. But the difficult thing with tight end is that some offenses aren't tight end centric, and the scheme kind of limits some tight ends from breaking out. And we see, heavily efficient players all the time at the tight end position never have a top 5 breakout type of season, even though if they were wide receivers, the indication might be that they could be good breakout candidates. And other thing too, is that if you have an 8+ touchdown season at the tight end position, you're pretty much going to be a top 6 tight end, no matter what, because the position is so scarce. So for me, more so than wide receivers, I do weight things like scheme, coaching staff, quarterback play, how good the offense is, touchdown opportunities, stuff like that, a little bit more than I would for wide receivers. But the ultimate, goal is to invest in talented tight ends.
100%. I mean, if we look at some of the leaders last year at the tight end position, and I'll get into the breakouts in a second, but just off the leaders alone, Travis Kelce, attached to Patrick Mahomes, great offense, plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. TJ Hawkinson, we'll get into in a second, but the Vikings, whatever opinion you have of Kirk Cousins, they were still one of the top 10 or so offenses in the NFL. George Kittle, we know how talented that San Francisco offense is as a whole. Mark Andrews, obviously volume, and when Lamar Jackson is healthy, that team is absolutely rolling. And then, of course, Evan Ingram, which I'll get into in a sec, but Jacksonville Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence, great offense on the stretch. In terms of the actual breakout part, I kind of mentioned it. TJ Hawkinson is a former first-round pick, 9.2 RAS score, which honestly surprised me. I don't think many people realize, but TJ Hawkinson is more athletic than people want to give him credit for. 4.7 speed, 255 pounds, has more athleticism, has more juice than people like to give him credit for. And he was always, a reliable, mid-ish tight end 1 type, but he finally broke out this past season as the tight end 2 overall. And the reason why is when he was traded to the Minnesota Vikings in season, he was tethered to a good offense. He got elite usage as the number 2 weapon on that team outside of Justin Jefferson. And we saw him fully break out. And like you kind of said with the touchdown point, the touchdowns have always been there with TJ Hawkinson, but that prop up to that number 2 in the offense really helped him out and boosted his value.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think schematically too, I said sometimes it factors in. You go from an offense that was running like a New Orleans Saints type scheme, which, despite having successful tight ends like Jimmy Graham in the past, we haven't really seen a successful Saints tight end in a long time. Then he goes to an offense run, with your, Kevin Stefanski, like wide zone 49ers, West Coast type of scheme. TJ Hawkinson's then able to break out, like you said, better quarterback, better offense overall. But schematically, I think they use their tight ends a little bit better, which also contributed to TJ Hawkinson's breakout. And then you also mentioned Evan Ingram, too, who former first-round pick, high athletic score. We knew he was a great athlete when he came out. He battled injuries, battled inconsistencies when he was with the New York Giants, but he finally broke out with the Jacksonville Jaguars because he went from an offense that didn't really pass the ball very much, had some, talented wide receivers that he was competing with, and also was an inconsistent at the quarterback position. He goes to a good offense with a great young quarterback in Trevor Lawrence, and he's able to have this like breakout second half of the season and win people fantasy championships.
Yeah, occupying that role as the number 2 weapon in the offense after Christian Kirk as well. And I think that's another underrated thing that you kind of mentioned too, is the role in the offense, right? Like you want a player that can facilitate as that number 2 weapon in their offense or number 3 weapon in their offense. I mean, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, all guys that have done that in the past. So that's another thing you should be looking out for. What exactly is their role in their offense? Are they an ancillary piece or an integral piece?
Yeah, for me, it's pretty easy. I just like to look for tight ends. I just like, give me a decent draft profile, give me a good athlete, give me a guy who's in a pretty good offense and has an opportunity to at least be like the number 3 or better option in his offense, maybe even number 2 or better option in their offense. Only pretty much Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews and
Number 1.
like that, they're pretty much the only number ones in their offense. Maybe prime Darren Waller a couple years ago as well, but for the most part, at least be the number 2, and you're pretty well set up. And I mean, we can talk all day until we're blue in the face about guys like Greg Dulcich, who could be the number 2 in his offense. A guy like Pat Freiermuth could eventually be the number 2 or 3 in his offense. We could talk about, Dallas Goedert, who we talked about last year as a breakout candidate. Even David Njoku, who could be the number 2 or 3 in his offense. There's definitely a lot of guys that fit the description of good draft profiles, good athletes, could be in good offenses. That could be at least the number 3.
Yep. No, fully agree there. But either way, we went through the quarterbacks, the running backs, the wide receivers, and the tight ends. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. It's just a lot of fun going down, breaking all of these specific ideas down, and ultimately making you guys better dynasty players.
Yeah, this wasn't necessarily to say these are our favorite breakout candidates, because we didn't really say who we think are great breakout candidates. What we're saying is how you can evaluate who's a good breakout candidate, because, some things are going to matter more to you than they do to us. And this is kind of the process we take. So you can go into your own rookie drafts, and if you're on the board deciding between Rashad Bateman and, I don't know, some rando wide receiver that's going to be productive, you can be like, hey, Rashad Bateman, I'm going to rebuild right now. He has an opportunity. He was a good prospect. He's going into his 3rd year. He's been dealing with injuries. He has an opportunity in front of him that if he's a talented wide receiver, and these metrics say that he could be, that he could, really accumulate value from like the 9th, 10th round starter pick that I'm paying for him now to eventually become like a 4th or 5th round starter pick.
For sure. And like, for example, you kind of threw out the tight end position. If you miss out on the Kelce's, the Kittles, the Goddards earlier in your draft, and you're in the teen rounds are some of my favorite spots at just throwing darts at some productive, potentially accumulated value tight ends. Guys like maybe, like you said, Greg Dulcich, Chigakonkwo, Jake Ferguson, I mentioned on a recent video, guys like that have the opportunity to elevate in their offense that are very, very cheap, because unlike the wide receiver position, like you said, they're valued highly even before they break out. For the most part at tight end, if a tight end hasn't broken out yet, they are almost dirt cheap on the market.
Yeah, and the awesome thing for tight ends too is that if they do break out, they can if Chigakonkwo has like a top 5 season next year. I don't think that's likely to happen, but if he does, he's gonna be like the dynasty tight end 3. He'll go up that high in value. So that's the fun thing about the tight end position. He'll go from a 14th round startup pick to like a 5th round startup pick, especially in like tight end premium leagues. So definitely that is the end of the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you enjoy the series so far. We're going to be coming at you with tons of macro-based videos, spotting breakouts, breaking down mistakes that people make in their rookie drafts, like everything under the sun relating to dynasty fantasy football that is not, this player over that player type of analysis, just macro-based game theory. So this will be releasing, for those of you guys that are watching this in like April or May or something on the YouTube channel, we release these as a precursor way in advance to our Fantasy Flock subscribers. And we're going to be doing this, more too. We're going to be doing this throughout the redraft season as well. So if you want early access to some of the content like this, go check out the new website. If you guys are already watching this on flockfantasy.com, check out some of our other content there as well. And as always, use the promo code FSC to get some exclusive benefits from us and 30% off. So with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.